Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the launch of our project on the triggers of return for Syrian refugees from in Lebanon and in Jordan. We're delighted that you could join us. This is a project that's been almost a year and a half in the making. Before I turn it over to Ben Hubbard, who has graciously agreed to moderate this panel, I just want to say a word of thanks to all the refugees. I know a couple of them actually are here, but all the refugees who took part in this project, who gave us not only of their time, but shared their individual stories with us. Without them, this project would simply not have been possible. We hope that this report will contribute, even in a small measure, in making their voices heard in terms of what they see for the future of Syria. Ben, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, greetings everyone. Thanks for coming today. We're here today to discuss the launch of a new report on one of the most critical aspects of the Syrian conflict and the ways in which this conflict is echoed throughout the region, which is the refugee crisis, which has obviously impacted Lebanon very heavily, as well as other neighboring countries. After 7 years of war in Syria, with the Syrian government now restoring its control over various areas, many people around the region and further afield are starting to ask, what is it going to take for the refugees to be able to go home? What are the conditions that will allow for this to happen? This report, which you can pick up a copy of outside, Unheard Voices, What Syrian Refugees Need to Return Home, seeks to provide answers to some of these questions by exploring the attitudes of the refugees themselves. It was based on about a year of original research in Lebanon and Jordan, extensive interviews with refugees, focus groups, to really look at how the refugees themselves are seeing these issues and how they're feeling about the prospect of returning to Syria. Let me begin by introducing our panelists. To my left is Maha Yahya, the director of the Carnegie Middle East Center. We have Murad Erdogan, the director of the Migration and Integration Research Center at Turkish-German University in Istanbul. And we have Jihad Yazji, the editor-in-chief of the Syria Report. Just to begin, if you have not read the report yet, which I assume you have not, one of the wonderful things about the report is that there are a lot of voices of actual Syrian refugees cited in the report. One that struck me as I was looking over it today was a woman named Farida, named Holmes, that said, "We are tired of the label refugee." So in order to get started, Maha, why don't you just give us an overview of the report, the methodology to collect all this information and the overall findings?
Thank you. Thank you, Ben. Sorry. Thank you, Ben, for this introduction. As I said, this project was a year and a half in the making, and just to also announce, it was done with the gracious support of the United Kingdom and of the Swiss Embassy, the UK Embassy here, and the Swiss Embassy, the UK FCO, and the Swiss Human Security Department. The project, our findings are based on 38 focus group discussions that we held in Lebanon and in Jordan with a very broad variety of refugees, including, as well as a mini survey, a series of workshops. Some of the audience here had took part in our workshops and roundtable discussions and one-on-one interviews. You will find at the back, in the annex of the report, a detailed explanation of our methodology and how we went about with the current findings. I'm going to start with a small quote from the refugees themselves to give some context to the project and to the problem itself. One of the refugees, when we asked in terms of their lives here, trying to understand what they were struggling with here, would say, perhaps death is better for us, as in every sense of the word, it is better than this life. Imagine a child that has no milk to drink. I don't have diapers to change for her. If I buy for her, I deny income to the rest of the household. I am the only one working in a household of 8 people. I think this quote encapsulates the current conditions under which refugees live, both in Lebanon and in Jordan, it also encapsulates some of the challenges that they face on a day-to-day basis. The report itself outlines a lot of these challenges, whether it's related to employment, to residency, to access to education and health, and even relations with host community. And it tries to contextualize the kind of life that refugees are facing and the challenges they're facing in Lebanon. Just as one caveat to also make it clear, when we started the project, we tried to understand the what was the demographic makeup of refugees in both Lebanon and Jordan. The two things that stuck out is that almost 42% of refugees in Lebanon come from the areas of Homs and Aleppo, whereas in Jordan, 43% come from the area of Der'a, with another 16% coming from the area of Homs. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning these figures is because they do have significant implications on people's willingness to return. Where you come from has a very direct connection to not their willingness, but their ability to return. I should start out with a caveat that the majority of refugees want to go home. They would love nothing better than to go home, but the challenges that they face in terms of going home are substantial and considerable. Now, the triggers of return, the report is sort of organized under a number of key findings: why they left, their attitudes towards resettlement. We look at views on timing, when is it that they can go back, what it is that they need to return, and the Syria that they want to see. The majority of those who left under incredibly strenuous conditions. Most of them escaped conflict. For example, 60% of refugees left because there was considerable insecurity in the areas they were in. Many of them had been displaced multiple times within Syria before making the decision to cross the border into Lebanon or into Jordan. So this finding, to a certain extent, challenges some of the mainstream rhetoric that some refugees or the refugees overall are economic migrants. These people are not economic migrants. They left to escape conflict. They left to escape barrel bombs or the direct targeting of their own family members, their friends. I mean, some of them recounted stories of having seen their own family members being killed in front of them, or friends, and etc. So these people, I mean, perhaps the bottom line here is they are not economic migrants. They are political migrants in that sense. They left to escape hostility and bombings. In terms of the return to Syria, and I will quote a young man from rural Damascus. In the report, we name the refugees, but obviously for safety reasons, we've changed all their names. This was something we promised them when we began the project, to protect their privacy as well. A young man from rural Damascus who lives in Gaza in Lebanon would say, "We are all looking to live safely. We are living without dignity in Lebanon, but it is what it is. This is better than Syria security-wise for our children and siblings. We will return to Syria if there is security. That is, if the regime is gone and there is security, which means there is no killing and no bombing." Perhaps this quote, to a certain extent, encapsulates one of the most important findings of this report, which is, while the number one demand of Syrian refugees was safety and security, in their minds, this safety and security can only be guaranteed through a political transition. They need to see a political transition to be able to trust that their safety will be guaranteed. Currently, it is not safe for most refugees to go back to Syria, particularly as I outlined the areas of origin, whether, for example, for those from Homs, there are a whole body of challenges that make it impossible for them or very difficult for them to return, not to be categorical. But one of those is the question of safety and security and being able to trust that whatever governance mechanisms are put in place will guarantee the safety and security. In the minds of the refugees, the current regime, or the majority of refugees, the current regime is not able to give them these guarantees, particularly with the increasing rhetoric about how Syrians who fled Syria are viewed as traitors to the nation for having fled the country in its hour of need. I mean, we keep hearing this over and over again in the mainstream press in Syria. In addition, there are frameworks that are being put in place, whether it's related to the recuperation of housing, of property. We go into a lot of this detail in the report itself. Vetting mechanisms, conscription. The conscription of young men is one of the biggest obstacles of return for Syrian refugees because I don't know how many of you know, but all men between the ages of 18 and 42 are required to go and serve in the army army now. For many young men, it's basically tantamount to a death sentence. They know that if they go, they will be sent to the front lines, and they don't want to do that. And often, repeatedly, we'd hear the same thing from young men saying, I don't want to kill and I don't want to be killed. I left Syria because I don't want to kill and I don't want to be killed. They simply don't want to be part of this conflict. Perhaps another kind of top finding, and this is of relevance to the international community, but also as we move forward thinking about what is possible in Syria, is that for many Syrian refugees, the issue of the availability of jobs, of services, security, and housing, these are all important. However, again, they come secondary to the availability of safety, security, and to political transition. So in many ways, and no pun intended here, but in many ways, at every single level, politics would trump economics at a broad level amongst refugees. First and foremost, their concern was, how do I guarantee that when I go back, I will be safe and my family will be safe and my children will be safe as well and can actually build a future for themselves. There is concern with the apparent fragmentation of Syria, the sense that with all the militias on the ground, too many forces are in control, and this again means that safety and instability will continue in Syria. They're also very worried about the absence or their own access to justice and the inability to access any kind of judicial mechanisms, the sense that they will have no resource, no one they can turn to for anything that goes wrong. But the question of justice came up repeatedly in our discussions with them, particularly amongst the women, interestingly. The sense that there need to be some sort of transitional justice mechanisms. Of course, they don't use the word transitional, but they talk about justice. And some of the quotes you'll see in the report about refugees who would say, how can I trust going back if I'm going to go back and see the person who killed my brother or my father or my friends wandering around, living life as usual, and how will I trust that I will be safe? And the other thing that they were very worried about, that in this kind of a context, there will be no mechanism to stop revenge killings. So again, instability will continue under this kind of a situation. They were also very worried. One of the demands is they would like to see the release of detainees, particularly political detainees. They want to know what's happened to those that have disappeared. These all came in, not as preconditions, but as things that are fundamental to their sense of safety and security once they go back to Syria. I'm not going to take up much more time. Now, on their political attitudes, perhaps the kind of bottom line was we asked them about what they saw as the future of Syria. What is the Syria that they want? What is it that they would like? And again, I will quote another young man, this time who's living in Zabadani in the Bekaa Valley. We asked them what is it that they want, and they kept talking about a just Syria. They would talk about a just Syria, a free Syria. These are the kind of categories. A territorially united Syria. They don't, as in the words of one refugee, I don't want a visa to go from one part of Syria to another. So they all reject the kind of this notion of de-escalation zones, the idea that you'll have different zones of influence. This is not the Syria that they look for. They are very adamant that they lived together once and they can live together again. They want an inclusive Syria. Political transition for them is not about excluding various population groups, but it's very much about including everyone. They want a representative Syria where they can see themselves and they can see their own political representatives. And we go more in detail in the report in terms of what the implications of that could be. But they also talk about a just Syria. And when we ask them to speak about what does a just Syria mean to you, they would say justice is, and I quote, this is the young man from Zabadani, justice is to have a change in government, to have justice ministry. If someone kills, they're held accountable. If you complain, someone listens. And if you tell them your house was destroyed, they help you or give you a loan. In other words, having a state. Right now, we don't have even the qualities of a state in Syria. So I think this issue is quite remarkable and quite important. And often they would, when we ask them to describe a little bit what they saw, they would refer to Europe. We want something like Europe. And what they meant there very much, I mean, what would come out, they want a system that is accountable and where institutions are accountable and hold people accountable. Then when we asked dug a bit more about the political characteristics of future Syria, they spoke of liberal values. I mean, they spoke of fair and free elections, the rule of law and equality, freedom and human dignity, and as I said, Europe was the example. So they really are craving for a political transition in that sense. Finally, what were kind of our policy recommendations coming out of this? And maybe this is where we can have a bit more discussion, not only today, but I'm hoping over the next few weeks. We advocate for a refugee-centered framework for the political transition. This is something we've done before, and we've kind of are pushing further on this. We truly believe that without a refugee-centered political settlement, instability, Syria will continue to be an unstable, or the epicenter of instability in the region, with all of what that includes. I think one of the most important caveats of this is to acknowledge that the refugee crisis has political roots. It's a humanitarian crisis, but with political roots. And without a political settlement, that crisis will not be resolved. I think the second thing is that justice has to be the centerpiece of a peace settlement. This may sound like blue sky thinking, but if without a kind of at least a sense of what justice would look like in Syria, a stable Syria will be very difficult to achieve in either the short and long term. But I think more importantly for the international community, the sense of international accountability, and I mean we can talk about whether the strikes are trying to address this in some shape or form, but the ability for the international community to continue to uphold some sort of international standards about what justice could look like, I think is also, and what accountability could look like, I think is also quite important. And the final kind of piece of that centerpiece, the three pillars of a refugee-centered framework, is really upholding the right of refugees to return home. And what we mean here is not just only in terms of respecting their right to return home voluntarily, i.e. respecting the principle of non-refoulement, but also working with host countries to limit the conditions that may push refugees out of Lebanon and Jordan, and as well as dealing with the conditions that prevent them from going back. I already mentioned some of them, including their inability to access, there's a whole new framework, property rights framework that is being put in place that facilitates the expropriation of the property of refugees, issues to deal with reconstruction, vetting, conscription, and so on and so forth. There are quite a panoply of new legislations that are coming up that will make it increasingly and incredibly difficult for refugees to go back, let alone to go back safely. I think there are sort of three main policy recommendations. We talk about the plan for a political transition. We talk about the need to ensure that any reconstruction / stabilization, I mean, we're sort of moving between those two realms. If there is going to be any funding, it should not become a means to empower the regime, and there's a real concern about this. Probably Jihad may address some of that. And finally, as I said, respecting the right of refugee to voluntary return with all of what that means. I'll stop right here. Sorry if I took a bit too long.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Just so everybody knows, we're going to let each of the panelists have an opportunity to speak, and then we'll open up for questions, so you can save your questions until that portion. Jihad, let's move to you. You've spent many, many, many years, even before the crisis, studying the Syrian economy, and obviously the conflict, 7 years of conflict have done tremendous destruction to many communities in Syria, physical, in terms of infrastructure, everything like that. So I'd like to ask you how the whole question of reconstruction, which is something that we're starting to hear conversations about, how this ties into the refugee issue.
Sure. Sorry. Thank you, Ben. Hello, everyone, and thank you to Carnegie for inviting me, having me here today.
Maybe just before answering your question, Ben, what I would like to say just a few words about the economic situation today in Syria. As you may know, obviously the economy is massively destroyed. We are talking of a destruction of infrastructure, of the outflow of capital and of the middle class, and a severe contraction in production and economic activity. Now, what is interesting is that in the last year, we have for the first time had, many sectors of the economy have stopped declining. Some of them have grown. It's difficult to assess whether GDP as a whole has grown or not, because you have a number of sectors such as agriculture and government services that represent a very important part of the economy that have probably declined and that will probably continue to decline this year too. But having said that, some sectors such as manufacturing, transport, energy have witnessed some growth, which is not surprising given the circumstances, which are basically the end of the battle in most of Western Syria, if you want. Now, having said that, as I said, the situation of the economy is very bad. Unemployment is very high. And the economy suffers from a number of challenges. Lack of capital, of course, but for instance, and that is of direct concern to a refugee issue, in the farming sector, for instance, there is a shortage of workforce. In the cities, you have a shortage of skilled labor. Just yesterday, an official at the Syrian Ministry of Labor was saying that in the job market today, there were 4 times more women than men applying for jobs. Now, that number seems quite surprising to me, but it is a fact that today you have a shortage of a number of a position. Now, as I said, so economy is slightly improving from a very low level, but unfortunately, I can't see this. Most probably this year too, we will have some growth in some sectors, but I doubt very much that this can be sustained. And here we come to the issue of reconstruction. So is there or can there be reconstruction in Syria anytime soon? Now, given the current circumstances today, given the political situation across the Middle East, it is very difficult to think of any reconstruction of any major scale happening in Syria. For a very simple reason. There is no money to pay for reconstruction. The traditional main funders of this type of efforts are Western countries, Western international institutions such as the World Bank, the IMF, or Gulf countries. Basically, these are the countries that lost the war, and they are not going to put money into the economy. And the countries that won the war, Russia and Iran, simply do not have the funds. Besides, and that's actually something that the government itself is admitting. Government officials say, we are not going to receive money. We have to manage without money. So there are talks of other issues. One of these is PPP, public-private partnership. That is partnership between the private and public sector, where basically the government would authorize private sector to invest in specific sectors, provided the private investor bring in the money. But here again, you have a major challenge, which is the incapacity today of the banking sector to lend. This type of projects work only if, and any economy of that, of any scale, cannot grow and develop if you don't have a solid banking system. Just to give you an idea, the combined assets of the 14 private sector banks in Syria, their combined assets at the end of last year were around $4 billion. Bank Audi in Lebanon, a single bank alone, has assets of around $40 billion. So it gives you an idea of the scale. The banks cannot lend. And the whole environment, legal and regulatory, is not encouraging for PPP project. The government too is broke. It can today continue to pay salaries, a minimum level of overhead, but it is incapable of investing. Even in areas such as the coastal area. One example I was following recently was the University of Tartus. The government announced the creation of a university in Tartus. In general, it has been announcing a number of projects in the coastal area, very often, because the coastal area gave a lot to the regime, obviously. Now, 3 years later, not a single building of the university has still been built. And Imad Khamis, the prime minister, was recently, a few months ago actually, was on a visit in the coastal area. And in government media itself, you had people complaining that he hadn't dared visit them because the government was not implementing anything. So here again, too, you have a problem of money, very, very simply. So what is the government doing, and what is the strategy? Is there an economic strategy for reconstruction? Well, it doesn't seem to be yet, the government doesn't seem to be having any form of strategy. You have working groups at the state planning commissions, for instance, that are thinking about what to do in the future. But you don't have any comprehensive strategy or even, if you want, beginning of thought about how to rebuild the country. You have priorities. One of these priorities is to pay back the allies of the regime. So for instance, we have Russia, which is getting access to the country's energy and underground resources in general. Just yesterday, the Syrian parliament enacted a law that confirmed that if you want allowed, because for contracts involving underground resources, you basically need a law. And Stroytransgaz, a Russian, major Russian engineering company, was awarded a contract to develop the phosphate mines, some of the phosphate mines located near Palmyra. And it's striking because the deal involves, and that's official, that's how the law was passed. The government gets 30% of the revenues, and the Russian company gets 70% of the revenues. And you have a number of deals of that type that are being worked through. So in other words, and we have also heard of competition between Russia and Iran, and the Iranian being upset at the Russians being favored. None of this should, should let us think that this is going to have a political impact. It doesn't mean that these countries are, in any way under. I mean, there may have some competition between them, but not to the extent that they would be, ending their alliance in Syria. But it is important to realize that one of the strategies imposed a bit by the friends of the regime is to pay back the government. And so that means also resources that will not be available, less resources available for funding reconstruction. Another consequence, priority of the government is to reward the powerful business figures that are around the regime, which have funded it, helped it in many ways. And a landmark deal in that respect, a landmark project in that respect is the famous Decree 66 project, the Basatin al-Razi project, which is a real estate development in Damascus, where basically people have been expropriated, compensations have been very low or non-existent, and instead a number of projects of investment have been signed with private investors. Now, on Monday, the 2nd of April, a new law was passed, which is law number 10, which basically extends the provisions of Decree 66 to the whole of Syria. And what this law basically says is that any local administrative unit, such as a city or a province, has the right to designate an area as an area to be redeveloped, a real estate area to be redeveloped. And these are mainly informal areas and areas that are destroyed. And as such, these areas, people living in these areas will be expropriated, and investment will be encouraged. So to some extent, you need investment in real estate areas, and sometimes you may have to go through expropriation. The very worrying thing is that with this type, quite clearly, the areas that are targeted are areas from which a lot of refugees come from. For instance, after the enactment of the law, the Minister of Housing specifically said that among the 3 areas that we are going to start working on, the first is Baba Amro, which is symbolic of the opposition. The second are the informal areas of Aleppo. And the third is Harasta. So that's a signal that it is also sending that, these are the areas we are going to rebuild. These are the areas that are going to be expropriated. And given the current Syrian circumstances, people who will be losing their assets, their homes, will not be able to claim them. Although the law says if you have property deeds, you have the right to claim them. But many people do not have property deeds, or lost them. People will not dare claim them. And a lot of people in the first place were either living under long-term rent contracts or anyway. So the conditions are not really met. So where does that put us? Should we encourage funding reconstruction or not? Now, I think that all of us, when you look at Syria, we first need to remember, and Syrians as much as others, that there are 15, 16 million Syrians living inside. And for their benefit, but also theoretically, for their benefit and for the benefit of refugees, it would be good to encourage reconstruction and economic activity in Syria. Would funding the Syrian government today lead to that? Under the current circumstances, I don't think that this will lead to that. I think it could lead to negative impact. It doesn't mean that one should not think about providing some funds, but I think one needs to be very careful as to where this money is going. Specifically, if our ambition, our target is to bring back refugees. If we bring back refugees to the central government is going to spend this money through the warlords, which are ruling today the country across the country, ruling the country across the specific areas. The very same people who basically in the first place expelled the refugees. So you have an issue here. You obviously have corruption, which was already very high in Syria, and today which is significantly higher. So you have significant loss of money that will incur. You also have, of course, the issue of sanctions, the risk related to that. You also have the issue that if today we want to bring back refugees, we need to create jobs. If we want to create jobs, we need to invest in sectors that relatively traditional productive sectors, labor-intensive sectors. The regime is not, and it hasn't been part of the policies of the Syrian government for a long time, to prioritize that type of sectors. The only sectors we are looking into, are today upscale real estate development projects in the outskirts of the city, of the main cities. So all these combined do not provide, if you want, a convincing argument today as to why one should fund the government. That does not mean that one should not look at things to do in Syria. Helping some of the infrastructure, water, electricity, certainly not by funding the government to go and buy power plants. Maybe technically, I don't think it's feasible. Provide directly the equipment needed from Europe so that you avoid the corruption thing, for instance. Looking at maybe funding very labor-intensive sectors that cronies are not interested in. I don't know, garment sector, typical, traditional, not high profit, but labor-intensive. The farming sector, which is also important, which would bring back people. Or you could even theoretically suggest to fund the government, to provide funding for reconstructing, rebuilding specific areas, say Daraya or Qusayr, but with conditions. We rebuild Qusayr on the ground that one, the people of Qusayr have the security and political guarantees that they can return. As Maha was saying, that is a priority for everyone. Two, that they recovered their property deeds and their homes. Three, that the money is channeled through dedicated funds that are monitored in a way or another. I'm not sure how technically this is feasible, but this is something that one can offer so that the money that is sent is as efficient as possible, there is as little corruption as possible, and we support as little as possible the regime which in the first place led to the expulsion of most of these refugees. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Murat, you're visiting us from Turkey, which in terms of sheer numbers has taken in more Syrian refugees than any other country. Just give us a briefing on, the report deals with refugees in Lebanon and Jordan. Just give us a briefing on how the findings that Maha discussed compare to what your research has shown on the situation of refugees in Turkey.
Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation, and congratulations also for the report. It's very important for us. My foreign language is German, and then I will try to speak English. I am sure you will understand me, but it will be not correct and then perfect English sentences. And I will bring some, that is not, okay.
There you go.
Ben said that I am now at Turkish German University in Istanbul since November 2017. I was in Ankara at Hacettepe University. Why I am saying that? Because I was the director of a migration research center, and then we did a lot survey about the Syrian refugees since 2012, and about the employment issue, social cohesion, education, university students, etc., etc. Of course, it's a huge issue, and then a lot of aspects. But once I have to say that, as a migration expert, I have no hope more for return. It is a fact, and we can make maybe political plans, etc. But sociology will be always win. And then sociology show us the reality. They will stay forever in Turkey, in Lebanon, in Jordan. Okay. It is not easy to say that. It is not easy to accept that. You know, the last numbers I checked already in Turkey, the Syrian refugees only, 3,572,000. It is unbelievable number. If you compare the refugee number in 2011 in Turkey, we had only 58,000 refugees altogether. 58,000 only Syrian refugees, registered refugees, is now more than 3.5 million. And only last 3 months, registration process going on, and then we registered in Turkey more than 140,000 extra Syrians. It shows us we have extra Syrians in Turkey, and then the registration process going on. Maybe end of this year we will talk about more than 4 million refugees. And then we forget another refugees in Turkey. We have already more than 215,000 Afghani and more than 205,000 Iraqi, and then from Iran, etc., and other refugees. Because of the instability in the border region, we receive a lot refugees, and then now altogether it is at least 4.1 million. We have a big country, big population, 80 million population we have. It means 5% of our population. You cannot compare, of course, with Lebanon or Jordan. I can understand. But even it is really very big number. And then I see the numbers of the Syrian refugee numbers yesterday. Turkey is number 1, Lebanon is number 2, Jordan is number 3, and then Germany is number 4. How much? 540,000 Syrians. We have only in Istanbul these numbers. Only in Istanbul. We have 10 cities, they have more than 100,000 refugees. We have some cities, it is also similar in Lebanon, I am sure. There are more refugees than local people. But,
excuse me if I may, you began with an incredibly stunning statement, I think, for those of us in the region who watch these issues very closely, just saying that most of these people are not going to go home. Walk us through how you reach this conclusion, because I think that the general assumption that most people are operating on is that eventually people will go home. So why don't you believe that that's going to be the case?
You know, as a migration expert, I work on about the Turkish migrants in European countries, more than 20 years. And then we have another experience with them, refugees in Turkey. Turks were in European countries only for 1 year, and they had also a country to go back. But even for this picture, it was very difficult, especially if you have refugees, and if the solution, you cannot find a solution in a short term, and then if the refugees, not only in border area, but the other places, then it is very, very difficult to go back. I will give you some numbers, and then it shows us how difficult it is go back, and then it is actually they establish their life in Turkey, in Lebanon, in Jordan. In Turkey, we have till now, between 2011, 2018, more than 350,000 new babies, Syrian babies, they were born in Turkey. It shows us life is going on for all refugees also. They work also already in Turkey. More than 800,000 Syrian refugees work in Turkey as cheap worker. It's another reality. We cannot ignore it. But they are very active in Turkey. We have in our schools more than 600,000 children, etc., etc. And then they live in all parts of the Turkey. They have now friends, they have new relationship, etc., etc. It's a feeling issue, it's a sociological issue. Because of that, I said that. But not only, it is my view, we made also regularly surveys. I'm conducting a new survey called Syrian Barometer Survey. We will make it next 5 years also, and then the first one is published we can see also the Syrians and then Turks, what's the problems, what's the feeling, what is their decision, etc. It shows us very clearly, more than 60% of Syrian refugees in Turkey, they want to have Turkish citizenship. It shows us more than enough result. I mean, it is only 1 point. They are very satisfied to live in Turkey. If they compare with Syrians, Turkey is better. Health services, education, etc., etc. Okay, of course they are complaining about that. It is not easy to be refugees in Turkey or in any other country. It is, of course, very difficult. But in Syria, it is very difficult to see any solution. Not only the solution, also the stability, also the peaceful life. The problem is now not only the Russian, Turks, Americans, Assad regimes, or the others. Problem is now also the own local people, I mean the Syrian people in Syria and then Syrian people out of Syria. It will be not easy to go back and then to have acceptance in Syria. It is also not easy. In Turkey, till now, I can say that the social acceptance level is extremely high. 2011, only 58,000, and then we have now 4 million refugees. It is even not a subject for a politics. It is really strange. It is not normal. But Turks is ready to help Syrians, but they are not ready to share their life, their future. I think it's also similar in Lebanon, in Jordan also. But it is the reality. We have to learn that, and then we have to learn how we live together. It is another part of this issue. And one important aspect, we have a solidarity between the poor. You can also see in Lebanon or in Jordan, in Turkey, they live mostly with poor people. And it is in general in the world is also that. I mean, this solidarity, lack of the solidarity, we talk about that in the world, and then only 15% of the refugees, they are happy because they are in Western countries or developed countries. The other 85%, they live in poor countries or neighboring countries, etc., etc. It is the same picture we have also in Syrian refugees issue. More than 6.5 million Syrian refugees. Only 15% they live in Germany, in Sweden, etc., etc. But the other 85% they live with neighboring countries and the poor countries. Problem is not only this general view. Problem is also a local view. In Turkey, where they live, in Ankara, for example, in the capital of Turkey, or in Istanbul, if you look at in micro level, you can see the solidarity between the poor. Some of them ask me, why is the social acceptance level in Turkey too high? Because we have almost no problem. It's very good. And then I said that because we are not enough rich. It makes everything easy. And it is also for all neighboring countries the same one. Because of that, I said that. But one more time, we can find any solution for the Syrian regime, and then maybe a separation or another unique country with support the Americans or Russians or Turks or Iran. It will not change the situation of the refugees, unfortunately. They will stay here. It is not a wish, it's a reality. And because of that, we try to establish a peaceful life together with refugees. It is very important to recognize their rights, to give them opportunity for in their education, economic activity, etc., etc. And but if we think about that, they will go back. Maybe next day, next week, next year, 10 days, 10 years later, etc. Then it is a big barrier for a comprehensive integration strategy. It blocks everything. And then, maybe last point, actually Turkey is now ready, for comprehensive integration policy. But 3 months ago, our president, Erdogan, we have the same name, but I am not the Erdogan, I am ordinary Erdogan, don't worry. Our president said that because of the Afrin operation, he said that we are doing this operation not only against the terrorism, but also we want to send the Syrian refugees back. Of course, he knows very well it is impossible, but it was also a political message because he knows also the political tension in Turkey. It was not a political subject till now in Turkey, but in 2019 we have an election in Turkey, very, very important election, and because of that, he knows the reaction of the society, and he said that we will send them back. And then society in Turkish society is now more happy. I know, but it's the evolution, and then it will also next year, and then and in other years, etc. It will not change. Political actors, they can decide for war or crisis, etc., but they can not decide easily for peace and then for human beings. It is not easy. And as a migration expert, one more time, I said that we have to concentrate on the peaceful together life. It means integration policy in all sense, and the other expectation for return, etc. It is, of course, we have to it. We cannot ignore. Maybe some of them will go back. My expectation, only 10% of the Syrian in Turkey, they can go maybe back to Syria or to another countries.
Thank you. We want to make sure we leave enough time for questions.
Only one point.
Okay, yeah.
It was very interesting. I see here in the figure between men and women in Jordan and Lebanon. It's very interesting. Here the female are more than male. In Turkey, it's the opposite. And then the huge differences between men and female, and then men we have more than the others. It shows us. It is also a signal. It is very difficult to go back. Sorry for the...
Yeah, thank you very much. It's not a perspective that I think many people here would really like to hear, but it's very valuable to hear what your research has shown about Turkey. Thank you very much. Before we go to questions, Maha, I'd just like to bring it back to you because the conclusions that we heard from Murat are quite different from what we hear in the report. The situation, obviously, the government's response in Turkey has been quite different from that in Jordan and Lebanon. The report, it's very clear that most of the refugees that you spoke to in your research want to go home, and they still count on this as being a possibility. So just talk to us briefly before we go to questions about why you think the beliefs of the thoughts of the refugees are so different in these different countries where they're living now.
I think what Murat was referring to, just to be clear, is that while refugees may want to go home, the experience indicates that they eventually don't go home. So the use of the example of Turkish migrants in Germany is one. However, I think we need to distinguish here because obviously not one story it's not one size fits all, and one story does not necessarily reflect on the other. Conditions in the countries of the host countries are one factor that we need to take into account, but also conditions back home and the creating or facilitating an environment to which refugees would feel safe returning to, I think is a very important one. For most of the Syrian refugees that we met, whether in Lebanon or Jordan, that was their number one priority. If they feel that they are able to go back home, recuperate their properties, and they want to return to their areas of origin, it's not about going back to anywhere in Syria. They really want to go to their areas of origin, go back to their homes, and they have every right to do so. So if there is a facilitation and the creation of that kind of an environment for refugees, Syrian refugees, at least the ones we spoke to, whether in Syria or in Jordan, they would like to go there. The other factor I think we need to take into account for both Syrian refugees in Lebanon and in Jordan, they are fully aware of the sensitivities around their presence, whether it's the sectarian and demographic and political power balance in Lebanon, or whether it's the more ethnic balance, demographic balance in Jordan. They're very aware of the precarious political situation that they're in and the extent to which there is a lot of resistance to their presence due to very particular conditions in both countries. And I think this is also something we need to kind of take into account when we're assessing whether refugees will go home or not. Ultimately, the bottom line is they will go home if there is a political settlement that allows them to go home and that creates an environment that is safe for them to go home to and to go to their homes.
Okay. Good, thank you for that. We will open up for questions. I think we should probably do this in waves instead of individual questions. So let's try maybe 3 questions. We'll get responses, then we'll open it back up. Does that sound fair? 3, 4, 5, 3, 4, okay. Start right here, yeah?
Oh, thank you. My name is Fuad from AUB, American University of Beirut. Just quick reflection on what Murad mentioned. I mean, according to World Humanitarian Summit, now, in 2017, the average length of being displaced is 37 years. Comparing in 90s was 19 years. So there's an evidence that not too many people actually go back, and the number is increased by time. And we should really, with all these frightening numbers and ideas, but we need to think about what if the conditions are not there. My question now to you, Maha, for the methodology. Did you approach the middle class, upper class Syrian in Lebanon? Is there any sort of, or this is only for registered refugees in Lebanon and Jordan? Thank you.
Okay, next question. Yes, the lady in the orange shirt, right?
Orange.
Abir Bassam, I'm a journalist. I would like to ask about the form of collecting informations. Was it like by filling forms or interviews? This is how, I mean, interviews like it's like you're collecting oral history. And the other questions is your samples. Were they like from Syrian refugees who are living in the camps, certain areas like Baalbek or Beirut or the south, or I don't know. I mean, was it limited to certain areas, or was it diverse? Thank you.
Okay, we have a gentleman in the front row.
Basil Karado from the United Nations National Agenda for the Future of Syria. Actually, I have one comment and one question. The first comments I wanted to say, I mean, just it's a comment about what you were saying, Maha, that what's happening is a humanitarian crisis with political roots. I would reverse it. It's a political problem with a humanitarian impact. So it is the other way around. I would say it's very important to think about from this perspective, because when you think it this way, we don't deal with it as a crisis. We deal more proactively and try to design policies that could prevent a mere remedy exercise, but on the contrary, deal with it as a problem which had objective reasons that we will have to tackle in a more proactive way. I mean, if we take even the policies in host countries will be designed, should they be aware of this reality, they would have designed their hosting policies in a better manner. So that's at least an opinion. The second point, probably that's a bit of a question as well, is it's always dangerous when we try to generalize the issue. The question of the Syrian refugees, and that goes in line with what Fuad was asking, you have different segments of refugees and different reasons why refugees left. And in different places, those who are in Jordan or in Lebanon or in Turkey, they might consider coming back or not considering back otherwise than those who are in Europe. And here's just a quick remark to Mr. Mohammed. They go less to Europe because in Europe they pay the 500,000 that are in Germany cost Germany far more than these couple of millions you have because the living conditions are totally different and the way they are integrated are differently. So going into generalizing the subject of refugees and turning it into figures, it's quite dangerous when we design what type of policies we wanted to engage and to. So my question was exactly like Fuad, if it will be a question, that eventually how the segmentation was built and how it was structured. And a final note, it's about reconstruction. It is quite important, and that's a remark, and probably could be a very good policy recommendation, that to make sure also about the existing and ongoing laws that the Syrian authorities are issuing every day that could and will surely delay and make sure that there will be no real return of Syrians. And using this time, this free time of non-action to pursue this kind of, sorry for being late.
Okay. Lots of questions about the methodology of the report in terms of who was interviewed, geographic locations. Give us a rundown of that, please.
Just very quickly, since there are quite a few questions. I'll begin with Basil and Fuad. I think we're in agreement on the political roots of this crisis. So whichever way you flip it around, it comes to the same result, which is this is a political crisis that you need to deal with. If you want to resolve the refugee issue, you need to deal with the political roots of it. So this is whichever way you flip it, this is the bottom line of what we're trying to say. On the refugee return, I don't think we generalize at any point in the report. And in response to, reacting also to Fuad, we're very clear. This study was done in Jordan and Lebanon. I don't know. I thought I mentioned this in my introduction. This was in Jordan and Lebanon. It was based on focus group discussions. It was both registered and unregistered refugees, Fuad. We focused mainly on people. Also, there was a question on whether they were in camps. The refugees, you'll see in the methodology, in the annex of the report, the refugees were in areas across Lebanon, so there was no limitation from the south to Saad Nail, Nabatieh, Beirut, Tripoli. We ran focus groups over the year, almost a year, and the same thing in Jordan. We met with refugees across most of Jordanian territories where there are concentrations, both in urban areas and peri-urban areas, not to say really rural areas. In Jordan also we visited people in the Zaatari camp. We ran focus groups in Zaatari itself. In Lebanon, there were both informal camps, since we don't have any real refugee camps, but also with people across the spectrum. The composition of the refugees themselves also came. We drew up profiles for every focus group. So there was one focus group, for example, with young men from Aleppo. Some of the focus groups were with unemployed, unregistered. Other focus groups were with female heads of household, because 19% of the refugees in Lebanon, for example, are female heads of households. There was another focus group with young men from Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor specifically, that we had a long discussion with, and this was done in Tripoli. So the variety of people we met was quite broad, and we tried to cover as much as we possibly could. But at no point do we generalize, and we don't use figures. You will read this and you'll realize that we very rarely use figures, because this is a qualitative study. It's based on focus group discussions. So we don't go out and say 90% of the refugees in Lebanon and Jordan say this. We say 90% of those we spoke to said this or believed in this. So I think this is a very important caveat to keep in mind. As for the middle and upper class, Fuad, the gist of, the bulk of the refugees in Lebanon and Jordan are mainly, frankly, of the poorer, lower and poorer individuals. These are people who've lost most of their assets and have very little to go on. They're dependent on aid for the most part, so we focused mainly on them. However, we did a lot of roundtable discussions and workshops that you participated in, some of them, where we brought together a variety of colleagues, both professionals and what one would consider the middle class of Syria that is in Lebanon and in Jordan, to discuss the pertinent issues, to check with our findings, this has... Again, when you open the report, you see that there is a whole body of engagement that we had over the past year, not only in terms of doing the focus groups, but also discussing different aspects of this with as broad a range of colleagues as possible. Fuad, Samir, Jihad, yourself, Basil, and many others participated also in these discussions. So I think this pretty much covers this part.
Take a new round of questions. Yeah. Gentleman back here. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. My name is Ahmed Timsa. I'm a retired Army General of the Lebanese Army. I worked with the refugees for a lot of time during my service. I could say I would agree with the Turkish gentleman.
Mehmet.
I didn't get the name. Since the dawn of history, sir, of human history on earth, the refugees never returned back. Look at Adam and Eve, and look at us. We never returned. And we suffered so much from the problem of refugees as Lebanese. Madame Yahya, she knows about this. Till now, our crisis went from Ta'if, 1991, till now. Still we have refugees, people who don't live on their part of the country. And when you say that they want to go back to home, what is home? It is being occupied by another people. It's a sectarian country. It's becoming, people are just driving people in a sectarian basis. So why should they go back?
Yeah. I'm sorry, but I do have to... I think we're mixing apples and oranges a little bit here, because the sectarian aspects, to my mind, the Syrian conflict is a political conflict. There have been population transfers, but these are minimal when you talk about, compared to the broader conflict, the broader dynamics of conflict. So there are internal displacements within Syria. People are being moved. There are forced population transfers. Some of them are on the basis of politics. Some of them are on the basis of sect. But I think it's very hard to extrapolate from the internally displaced situation in Lebanon and to the dynamics of the Syrian conflict in Syria. If I may just say, it's a very different dynamic to my mind.
Did you have a question? I guess not. Okay. Sure. Yeah, Jihad. Yes.
You obviously triggered the discussion on this.
No.
Jihad wants to say something.
No, I agree with Maha, but I think at least there is a perception of a sectarian thing. Because if you talk to people, that exists. So, and in some cases you do have, but I agree with you. It's not by far not the main. Sure, of course.
Sorry, just
more questions?
Shirin Yazbek, I'm a reporter. Just I have a question because I've been covering the Syrian refugee crisis since 2011, and everybody tells me all the time, we ask them if you want to go back home, they tell us, but here we're receiving per tent, if you want, in the camps, $800, and what are we going to do in Syria? So I think my question is for Jihad. When you're saying that the Gulf countries are not willing to pay, Russia and Iran are almost bankrupt, or so who's gonna rebuild Syria? Is it gonna be rebuilt, or what kind of workforce or what kind of jobs need to be created so that the refugees can come back? Because they're not gonna just come back to do nothing.
Okay, more questions? The gentleman here in front.
Thank you. Maybe one of the important and significant indicators of whether there is a will to return is the degree of organization, of militancy that we could feel within refugee groups. if the Palestinian case is any indication, the Palestinian militancy started getting organized some 10 to 12 years after the Nakba, or the Naksi, whatever it was. As far as I know, and up until end of 2016, there were no significant intelligence reports that there was such militancy, except for some timid, movements, insignificant, more related to, jihadist, Islamist movements than anything else. My question, I have a question. My question is, do you think that this indicator of level of militancy is significant, and if so, do you think that it is worth following up on this element in maybe another study?
Okay, another question. Anyone in the back? Yes, lady in looks like a white shirt.
I'm Joël Bassoul from CARE International. We recently issued a report on the same topic with 5 other INGOs called Dangerous Ground, and we looked at the same issues. And returns are happening. Most of the time they're not voluntary, they're being sent back, but refugees are going back. In our report, we had very specific recommendations to the government of Syria. And I just skimmed the report. I didn't see specific recommendations, but in both cases, whether there are or aren't, how are we planning on engaging the government of Syria when there is no willingness or no sign of them to accept refugees back, whether in certain areas where there is demographic engineering or not, there is no national policy to take them back. And in our case, when they are sent back, we lose them. We don't know where they are. There is no aid organized there. There is no government policies to welcome them. So what happens to refugees, and how can we engage the government to work with us, with you and us and everyone, on returnees?
Okay. Jihad, there was a question about the economics of this, both in terms of what the refugees are receiving while they are refugees and what their economic prospects would be when they go back, and how this factors into their decision.
Yes. If the question is I think we have to accept that in the foreseeable future there will not be a reconstruction of Syria. We have to accept this in the same way that Mr. Erdogan was saying refugees are not returning. We have to accept it. Reconstruction in the sense of the large-scale inflow of capital and rebuilding of major infrastructure, of housing, this is not happening. There isn't money unless, of course, there is a political deal. But I can't see a political deal happening anytime soon. But so what is going to happen is you are going to have investment opportunities for some businessmen. You have people who are going to profit from the fact that there is less competition because Western companies do not come, and so on. But this will be, and you see, for instance, already some Chinese companies looking for opportunities in Syria. But this is very little, very, very limited compared to the massive scale of the destruction in the country. So the fact is that in practice, we should simply stop expecting reconstruction. I think this is important for the countries of the region, which also, if you look at the politicians or at people who are thinking in the long term, are banking a lot on reconstruction to help their economies grow. And they have to make plans on the basis that there will not be a Syrian reconstruction, I think. Yeah.
Okay, who would like to speak to the question of the prospects for militancy developing in the refugee communities? Anybody? Okay.
Since I think Shadi was asking me about this. I think the prospects for militancy depends to a large degree on how we continue handling the refugee crisis, in all honesty. If we keep treating we already have a lost generation of children. If we continue treating refugees like they are the plague of the earth and dealing with them with, in the way that we have seen so far, this may make them much more vulnerable, particularly a younger generation, to exploitation down the road. Is it something to watch? Of course, it's something to watch. It's something we need to watch it and be careful and actually preempt it through our own policies, whether in Lebanon or in Jordan. However, I think, again, I would hesitate to compare the Palestinian condition to the Syrian one. in terms of the development of a PLO-style organization in Syria. I think unlike the Palestinian refugee outflow was as a result of the establishment of the state of Israel. It's a completely different political dynamic. The Palestinian opposition became unified under the Palestinian Liberation Organization to a certain extent initially, and then you had. In Syria, it's a very different dynamic. There is no unified opposition. This has been one of the problems of a political transition. So I don't see something like, among other things, I don't see something like this developing in the region. But definitely, it's something I think to keep our eyes on and to try and preempt. What I would say, not the development of militancy, but actually to address the growing vulnerabilities of the young men and women, the young children of the Syrian children refugees, frankly, harnessing their potential towards something more positive, both for Lebanon, for Jordan, but also for Syria eventually down the road. On the issue of how can we engage with the government, I think this is a political decision with the Syrian government specifically. At Carnegie, we have no plans of engaging with the Syrian government, at least in the Carnegie Middle East Center. So I think this is very much of a political decision. To engage with whatever Syrian government, this has to be part and parcel of whatever political transition. It's not NGOs that can do it, it's not think tanks that can do it, and it's certainly nor international INGOs. This has to be part of a political process, and it has to be at the heart of any discussions of what will be a political transition down the road in Syria. Without this, there is no possibility of engaging with anyone in Syria, frankly. The conditions that you point to are things we also point to, and we say these have to have the urgent attention of the international community, and they have to be part and parcel of the political dialogue. So when we speak about detainees, when we speak about the disappeared, when we speak about property rights, these all have to be part of a political discussion around the end of the Syrian conflict. They can't be left as an afterthought. They can't be left, including the return of right of return for Syrian refugees. These cannot be an afterthought. But this discussion will not happen unilaterally or will not happen on a bilateral basis between INGOs or think tanks and the government. They will happen as part of a larger political transition.
Murat, can you speak briefly about the Turkish perspective on this? What role does it play in how Turkey handles this crisis that the Syrian government really has not come up with any sort of policy for the return of refugees? How does this affect the Turkish calculus on this issue?
Actually, Syrian refugees issue in Turkey more political issue, but in international area, not in domestic political, but international area. And because of that, Turkish government concentrated on the Damascus, not the Turkey. I mean, we had a lot of refugees, but they concentrate on the crisis, and then they thought that if the crisis ends, then they can go back. And then now, I think the most worst relation with Syrian regime we have, Turkish government. And it makes also everything more difficult. And then all the Syrians in Turkey, they feel themselves also, in this sense, discriminated of the Syrian regime. And then because of that, it is also for them difficult to go back. And then as I am saying for that, because of our survey, and then we can also understand their feeling and then their worry to go back to Syria.
Thank you. More questions? We'll have at least one more round, maybe two. Questions? Yes, right here.
Hi. Do you think the Lebanese government is playing a role in pressurizing the repatriation of Syrian refugees?
Okay. Other questions? Yes?
Perhaps along the same line, Samer Jabour from the American University of Beirut. I think the discussion has focused as much about the report, and thank you very much, Maha and team, as about the scenarios. And one of the scenarios that we have to be really prepared for, and this is perhaps a subject for extending the research, Maha, in the next phase, is in the venue that this war has been allowed to continue with atrocities of war committed on a daily basis, this war will see, or the next phase will see, potentially, we have to be prepared for that. And this is where research will really prove crucial about the scenario of atrocities of peace. I have no doubt, and most Syrians do not have the doubt, that regional governments, the international system of violence that governs us, are able, in the same way that they've allowed the atrocities of war to continue, will allow atrocities of peace to continue. So all of what you have found in your research, Maha, I think is an historical document. That's why it's important. It's a document of ethics, of morality. But what will happen is that with the current international climate, the atrocities of transition and forced return will happen, and we have to be prepared for that, and ask ourselves as researchers, as civil society, as concerned politicians, what is our response going to be then?
Do you have a question?
What is our response?
What is ours? Okay, all right. Okay, any more questions? Let's get another one in. Right.
Hi, Sohaila Hayek from Gogikan Foundation. Are we now saying that there will be no incentive for them to go back because of atrocities, because there is no jobs, because there is no opportunities? Therefore, are we saying the only hope for them to go back is a regime change, something that will guarantee them safety and perhaps the excitement of rebuilding a new nation? Is that what we're saying?
Yeah, we'll get one more and then we'll, yes? Up here, yeah.
Hi, Samar Adi from the Arab Weekly. Sorry, I came late. I thought it starts at 5 anyway. You said that the average refugee status is 37 years. I mean, for Lebanon and Syria, I mean, in Turkey, I can understand it's a big country, very rich. It can absorb productive Syrians. In Lebanon, I mean, the long stay, overstay of, and Jordan, the overstay of Syrian refugee, how would it, I mean, how would it have these implications in Jordan and Lebanon? I mean, okay, now you can hear people are fed up or something. I mean, how could that be more serious, the implications? I mean, if they overstay for 30 years, I mean, we've seen the overstay of the Palestinians. I mean, we cannot compare, it's different. But still, I mean, on the social level, there is, I mean, there are reactions. So how do you think this will impact Lebanon and Jordan? And you said, well, it's a political decision more than a humanitarian, because even if the Syrian regime doesn't want them, most of the refugees are families of the opposition. So obviously the Syrian regime wouldn't want them back. I mean, what political decision would take them back? I mean, this is what I was going to ask, and already it was asked, but the impacts of their overstay in Lebanon and Jordan.
So we have a lot of questions about, okay, we have these conclusions, where do we go from here? You know, questions about what happens with the atrocities of peace. Does believing that we need a political transition mean that there should be a policy of regime change to facilitate returns? And so it's...
Okay. Let me just say that one of the main reasons why we did this project was really to put the voices of refugees up front and center, because they're the one group that is being talked about but not talked to, and their voice is not being amplified. So we're hoping that this will amplify their voices. The point of this report and this study was to actually make some of the issues, bring the discussion back on political settlement and on reconstruction back to where we believe they need to be, which is to talk about what it means to rebuild a country that people can go back to, what it means to have a political settlement that allows people who have fled the kind of brutality they have fled, it allows them to go back to in a safe and sustained manner. I think this is important, and in many ways we've lost sight of this central point when we, in all the discussions around the political transition in Syria, and should Assad stay and should Assad go and what is happening and Russian interests. This is, if we want a stable Syria and we want a stable region, then this has to be up front and center in any discussion on a political settlement. This is, again, not blue sky thinking, it's reality, actually, the realpolitik of the situation. Otherwise, we are going to be in an unstable region for a very long time. Now, is Lebanon complicit in the forced repatriation of refugees? In some instances, I think it has. We've seen instances of forced repatriation both in Lebanon and in Jordan. Joël mentioned some of them. We saw some of the deals that were done. So even though some people have gone back, and these are a minority, at least the ones that we do know about, many of them have gone back under either specific political settlements, as we saw in Arsal and other places, or in the case of Jordan, there have been forced expulsions. So I think it differs from place to place. The reasons for these vary in terms of what is being used as a reason for expelling these different people. Does that mean that how should Lebanon then respond to the fact, or to basically what we're saying, which is that the refugees here will be in Lebanon and in Jordan for quite some time? I think that's the next phase of, they do have, the presence of such a large number of people has serious implications on both the social and the economic constitution of both countries. Which is why we recommend that there has to be a sustained dialogue. Neither Lebanon nor Jordan can carry that burden on its own. I just came from the CEDR conference in Paris. Part of that is meant to create employment opportunities for refugees working here, along with Lebanese youth. So we need to look much more concretely towards policies that will enable refugees to both acquire the skills they need and to forge the future that they deserve to have as individuals and as communities. We're not talking about full-blown integration, which is a no word that's a no-go zone in both countries, but definitely making sure that they are able to lead dignified lives. Otherwise, the implications will be catastrophic in both countries, I believe. Because of the inability of people to go back. The way we're seeing, the way policies are moving, the direction they're moving in today, and some of the rhetoric we're hearing is very damaging for the long-term stability of all the countries concerned, I think. Finally, to your question, Suhaila, on the issue of are we saying that you need a complete political regime change for refugees to go back? No, what we're saying, many people here probably would love to see that happening, but or not. That's what I'm saying. Many people, let's say everyone. No, what we are saying very clearly is that for refugees, the bulk of the refugees who have left Syria, as well as some of those who are internally displaced, they fled barrel bombs, they fled population transfers, they fled quite atrocious conditions. So to guarantee their sense of safety and security and to enable them to go back, you need a political process. That political process is supposedly happening in Geneva. To my mind, Geneva has, to a great extent, become window dressing for the continuation of the conflict. We don't see a real process happening in Geneva at this point, in part because the regime does not really want that political process. It doesn't see a need for it. It considers that it is winning. There's no incentive. The incentive for the refugees is very clear. They want to go home. You don't need to provide a lot more incentives for them. They simply want to go home. So I think it's very clear to make a distinction between complete regime change and an actual political transition that will give individuals outside of Syria who have fled the conflict in Syria the necessary security guarantees that they need. But also one, as I said earlier, and as Jihad has talked about and many people have talked about, take into account the changing legal environment in Syria, the laws that have been reformed, whether it regards property, conscription, vetting mechanisms. They're not allowing people back in certain areas. People who fled Baba Amro, it's impossible for them to go back today. Things like this.
Jihad.
Yes, I just wanted to say something because I feel the subject Murad opened, saying the refugees are not returning, put some people a bit anxious, actually. Quite a number of Lebanese are anxious about that, which is understandable. But I think that you are right to highlight tensions, but you should also highlight the non-tensions in many places. Murad was talking about solidarity between the poor. I think this too applies in Lebanon. It is surprising, actually, the low level of conflict you have had across the country. You also have objectively a lot of segments of the Lebanese population that have an objective interest in having Syrian refugees. You can think of businesses because the supply of cheap labor brings down the cost of labor. In many areas, refugees pay land. I mean, it's paid by the UN, for instance, the Bekaa. They provide services. A shop that could, employ 2 people now can employ 5 at the same cost and make better delivery. So you also have these segments of Lebanese that also, which does not mean, of course, that you don't have real tensions. The sectarian one is a big difference with Turkey and with anywhere else. If the refugees were a third Sunni, a third Shia, and a third Christian, you would have much less problems, of course. Which is in Lebanon. Yeah, in Lebanon, I mean, of course. And maybe the presence of refugees can also be an opportunity for the Lebanese economy in some ways. Investment in infrastructure, for instance, in areas, because most refugees live in areas where infrastructure is very poor. You for the first time in Lebanon, you have a high pool, as I was saying, of low-cost labor. It may encourage investment, in other sectors. So given that they seem to be staying for quite a long time, let's try to seize this opportunity.
Okay, we've run up against our time limit. Thank everyone for coming. We have copies of the report available. The panelists will be here if you have any specific questions you would like to address with them. And thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Actually, I should also recognize my colleagues, I don't know if they're here, Jean Assir and Khalil Hariri, who are my co-conspirators in this report. So thank you to them as well.